Good evening, and welcome back to SleepWise. As a reminder, you can listen to this and every SleepWise story completely ad-free on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Now, settle in as we drift into tonight's story, where the quiet of night meets the wonder of discovery. Tonight, we drift through a sky that once seemed unreachable. Above us hangs the same quiet moon that has watched every age of humankind, its face pale and patient, its silence older than every story ever told. For thousands of years, it has been our mirror in the dark, a companion through harvests and heartbreaks, a reminder that the night could hold both mystery and calm. Its silver light touched the pyramids and the cathedrals, the mountain peaks and empty deserts, glowing softly across the centuries as the world below changed again and again. Long before rockets or radios, before the hum of engines or the pulse of electricity, people stood in open fields and traced its path across the heavens. The moon was myth and measure, a clock for tides and a guide for travelers. It appeared in the ink of poets and the prayers of sailors, in the lullabies whispered to children under thin roofs. It was the same light reflected in rivers and lakes trembling across the skin of the earth. Though unreachable, it felt close, a neighbor in the great quiet above. But as the 20th century awoke, its rhythm quickened. The earth filled with new sounds, the clicking of cameras, the hum of factories, the thunder of machines learning to fly. The wars had ended, but the silence that followed carried its own tension. A world divided in purpose, yet united in restlessness. There were two powers, each rebuilding, each watching the same sky and wondering who would reach it first. Beneath the calm of evening, in laboratories and offices, minds began to dream not only of peace, but of ascent. Engineers hunched over drafting tables, their pencils scratching faint arcs that hinted at escape. Mathematicians filled notebooks with symbols that spoke of gravity and orbit, of how to break free from the pull of Earth. Scientists, guided by both fear and fascination, saw in the stars a new stage, a place where progress and prestige might meet. The moon, once only a symbol of poetry, had quietly become a destination. And yet, beneath the politics and rivalry, there remained something purer, a shared longing to see beyond the blue, to understand what it meant to rise above the clouds and witness Earth as a fragile sphere of color and breath. Even in the quiet of ordinary nights, when radios played soft music and city lights blurred the stars, people looked upward with a new kind of awareness. The sky no longer belonged only to dreamers. It was waiting softly for the first signal from humankind. And so, as we lie beneath that same moon tonight, we return to that moment before everything changed. The stillness before the spark, the hush before the heavens answered. The world was on the edge of the impossible, listening for the faint hum of a new beginning. While the Gemini crews flew, another quieter saga unfolded on the ground, the construction of the machine that would carry humans to the moon. The Saturn V rocket, designed by Wernher von Braun's team, rose not simply as an engine of thrust, but as a cathedral of mathematics, metallurgy, and trust. The first stage, with 5 F1 engines arranged like a bouquet of thunder, drank 15 tons of propellant every second. The second and third stages burned liquid hydrogen, a fuel so cold it hissed like dry ice as it was poured. To test these pieces, NASA built new worlds on Earth. At the Stennis Space Center in Mississippi, test stand shook as engines fired for full mission duration, water spraying to dampen flames, frogs leaping from ponds in alarm. In Louisiana, welders crafted the huge fuel tanks in a factory so long that you could see the curvature of the Earth inside. In Florida, the vehicle assembly building took shape, a hangar so vast that clouds sometimes formed near its ceiling. At Cape Canaveral, Launch Complex 39 was carved out of swampland, its twin pads standing like altars to the sky. To move the finished rockets, NASA designed crawlers that inched along at less than 2 miles per hour, each footstep crushing the gravel beneath it into dust. The slow procession of a Saturn V to the pad became a ritual, a mechanical pilgrimage preceding a fiery ascent. Meanwhile, inside windowless rooms in Houston, a new kind of theater emerged. Mission Control was a place of headsets and screens, coffee cups and ashtrays. Console lights glowed in pastel blues and greens. Young engineers with flat-top haircuts and rolled-up sleeves sat beneath clocks labeled Flight, Boost, Retro, and GNC, each responsible for a sliver of the mission. When they spoke, they used call signs and acronyms, their voices steady in the face of uncertainty. Gene Kranz, with his crisp vests and deliberate cadence, taught his teams to work the problem, to trust data over fear. They drilled for emergencies, engine failures, cabin leaks, lightning strikes, until their responses became muscle memory. The culture that formed there was rigorous but tender. They celebrated births and mourned losses together, sharing long nights punctuated by bursts of applause when a stage ignited or an orbit was achieved. By 1967, uncrewed Saturn I and Saturn V launches had proven the hardware. The rockets flew straight and loud, leaving long contrails that curled in the high wind. In offices and homes, people watched the launches and held their breath until the boosters separated and parachutes blossomed. Across Florida, residents could feel the rumble in their chests and see the glow on the horizon. The pieces were ready. They only needed to be assembled with courage. In the midst of this momentum, tragedy would call everyone back to humility and resolve. The first crewed Apollo mission was meant to be a simple test in Earth orbit, a shakeout of systems before the complex lunar flights. On January 27, 1967, astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee sat atop a Saturn IB rocket in a capsule nicknamed Apollo 1. They were running a plugs-out test on the pad sealed inside a command module filled with pure oxygen at pressurized levels. Cables snaked out through the hatch. The countdown reached pause. Voices crackled in their headsets, and then came a sudden cry. A spark from frayed wiring ignited the oxygen, turning the cabin into an inferno. The astronauts struggled to open the inward-swung hatch, but flames raced faster than hands. Within minutes, the 3 men were gone. Outside, technicians pounded at the hull, their faces lit orange by fire. The smell of burned plastic and charred metal drifted in the cold air. News of the accident spread quickly. Flags were lowered, schools held assemblies, and the nation that had been racing toward the moon stopped, stunned by the cost. Newspapers printed black borders around their photographs. Children asked why heroes had to die. In the aftermath, engineers and managers gathered in somber rooms to dissect each failure. They replaced the pure oxygen with a safer mixture, redesigned the hatch to open outward in seconds, rerouted wires, and sealed flammable materials. They examined every assumption that had been made in haste and re-anchored their work in humility. The tragedy of Apollo 1 became a covenant. Never again would speed outrun safety. For 21 months, the program paused. During that time, the Soviet Union launched more Soyuz flights, yet their own rockets suffered catastrophic failures. Cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov died when his parachutes failed to deploy. The race had become a shared struggle against physics and time. When Apollo 7 finally lifted off in October 1968, its crew, Wally Schirra, Don Eisel, and Walt Cunningham, carried both memory and hope. Their mission remained in Earth orbit, testing the redesigned command module. Over 11 days they practiced rendezvous, broadcast television from space, and proved that the new systems worked. They argued with mission control when colds made them irritable. They joked and sang. They made mistakes and corrected them. When they splashed down safely, cheers echoed through assembly buildings and living rooms. The path to the moon, once smooth, now bore the imprint of sacrifice. Each countdown thereafter carried the names of Grissom, White, and Chaffee like a quiet prayer. The engineers and astronauts who followed stepped carefully, knowing that the ladder they climbed was built from both steel and morning. Out of that weight, however, rose a renewed commitment to do the impossible, not for glory, but to honor the ones who had fallen on the threshold. As 1968 drew to a close, a daring plan emerged. The lunar module was behind schedule, but the Saturn V and command module were ready. Rather than delay, NASA decided to send a crew to orbit the moon without a lander. Apollo 8 would leap over months of planning and become the first human mission to leave Earth's gravity, voyage to another world, and return. On December 21st, the massive rocket rose in a column of white flame, carrying Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. Inside, the astronauts felt the violent shake of the first stage, then the smooth acceleration of the second. 3 days later, as they fired their engine behind the moon, radio contact was lost. For 20 minutes, Mission Control stared at telemetry screens filled with static. Families held their breath. Then a voice crackled through the speakers. "Houston, Apollo 8. Please be informed there is a Santa Claus." Laughter and tears mingled. For the first time, humans were in orbit around the moon. As the spacecraft emerged from the far side, the crew looked out their small windows and saw the Earth rising over the gray horizon. The photograph Bill Anders took, a blue and white marble suspended in blackness above a barren world, would become known as Earthrise. It showed our planet as delicate and whole, without borders. On Christmas Eve, the 3 astronauts read from the book of Genesis, their voices echoing across the void to millions of listeners on Earth. In the beginning, they intoned, and people of many faiths and no faith sat in silence, united in wonder. The mission was not merely a technical victory, it was a spiritual one. The image of Earth made environmentalists and poets weep. Politicians paused. Children wrote the crew letters thanking them for showing that our world was both small and precious. When Apollo 8 splashed down safely in the Pacific, ships' horns blared and church bells rang. In the United States, the mission provided solace at the end of a turbulent year of assassinations and conflict. The path to the moon now lay lit by experience. The next time a Saturn V roared, it would carry a lunar module as well as a command module. The Earthrise photograph lingered on refrigerators and office walls, a quiet reminder that our home is just one among countless lights in the dark. The mission proved that humans could navigate to the moon, enter its orbit, and return. It also offered an unexpected gift: perspective. Those watching from beaches, farms, and city rooftops felt a connection not only to the crew, but to one another. Even as wars and protests raged, for a few days the news was filled with stars and silence, with images of a distant Earth rising like dawn over the moon's limb. The stage was set for the next act, to descend, to touch, and to leave a footprint where none had been before. In early 1969, NASA rehearsed the remaining pieces. Apollo 9 stayed in low Earth orbit, but carried, for the first time, the spider-like lunar module attached to the cone of the command module. The lunar module was unlike any spacecraft built before, an angular, delicate machine designed to fly only in vacuum and low gravity, with no need for aerodynamics. Astronauts Jim McDivitt, Dave Scott, and Rusty Schweickart tested every system. They practiced separating the two spacecraft, flying independently and then docking again using thrusters and radar. Schweickart donned a new type of spacesuit with life support strapped to his back and stepped out onto the lunar module's porch. He moved hand over hand along the struts, practicing the motions that would soon occur 240,000 miles away. The mission proved that the ungainly vehicle could function as a lifeboat and that astronauts could move between craft if something went wrong. It also revealed vulnerabilities. Schweickart suffered space sickness, and procedures were adjusted accordingly. A few months later, Apollo 10 performed a full dress rehearsal in lunar orbit. Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan rode a Saturn V to the moon and then undocked their lunar module, call-signed Snoopy, descending within 9 miles of the surface. They flew over craters and plains, saw the slopes of the Sea of Tranquility, and then fired their ascent engine to return to the command module named Charlie Brown. In the descent, an misset switch caused the module to roll violently. Before Stafford regained control, adrenaline spiked, but training prevailed. The tension of the mission was amplified by the knowledge that any failure might send them tumbling to the surface or drifting forever into space. Stafford's calm voice and Cernan's jokes hid the seriousness of their task. When they rejoined Charlie Brown, Mission Control celebrated quietly, aware that the hardware and procedures were now tested and proven. The Soviet Union attempted to mount a similar circumlunar flight, but suffered setbacks. N-1 rockets exploded shortly after liftoff, and the Zond program stalled. The gap between the two nations widened. Apollo 10's success was both a triumph and a tease. Astronauts looked through windows and saw the place where they longed to walk, but were ordered not to. The descent engine whispered them down and then roared them away. In interviews later, the crew spoke of the lunar surface as both close and unreachable. Meanwhile, on Earth, engineers double-checked checklists, seamstresses sewed flags and patches, and children cut out cardboard rockets and pretended to land on kitchen floors. The next flight, if all went well, would carry a call sign of eagle and the hopes of a planet. Everything that could be rehearsed had been. Only one mission remained before the dream could turn into footprints and dust. On July 16, 1969, at 9:32 a.m. Eastern Time, the Saturn V, designated Apollo 11, stood poised against a summer sky. Hundreds of thousands of people lined beaches and causeways near Cape Kennedy. some having driven all night to witness the moment. They tuned transistor radios, adjusted camera lenses, and held binoculars to their eyes. Millions more watched on television, gathered in living rooms, school auditoriums, and shop windows around the world. The astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edwin Buzz Aldrin, lay strapped in atop a 6 million-pound tower of fuel and engines. Armstrong, a former test pilot with a calm demeanor, had commanded Gemini 8 and tamed its tumble. Aldrin, a meticulous engineer nicknamed Dr. Rendezvous, had written his doctoral thesis on orbital mechanics and performed a spacewalk on Gemini 12. Collins, a sharp-witted Air Force pilot, would remain in lunar orbit to shepherd their return. As the countdown reached zero, the Saturn's engines lit with a flash brighter than sunrise. Slow at first, then faster, the rocket rose on a pillar of flame and thunder, shaking the ground and rippling the lagoon. Spectators felt the vibration in their chests. Television cameras panned up to follow the gleaming white body as it climbed and pitched downrange. At 12 minutes, Apollo 11 was in orbit. After a circuit of the Earth and a final systems check, they fired the SFBD engine again to leave Earth behind. The trans-lunar injection burn lasted 6 minutes. When it ended, the spacecraft coasted on a path that would intercept the moon. The crew removed their helmets, unstrapped, and turned to their tasks. Collins crawled through a tunnel and separated the command module, named Columbia, from the spent third stage. He rotated it 180 degrees and docked with the lunar module, still nestled in the booster. Armstrong and Aldrin peered through small windows at the spider-like craft they would soon trust with their lives. 3 days of coasting followed, punctuated by mid-course corrections, navigational sightings of stars through the sextant, and television broadcasts back to Earth. They described the smell of the spacecraft, the taste of their meals, the way water formed globules in the air. On the second day, the moon grew from a fingernail to a coin, to a world. The view outside their windows shifted from blue and white to gray and black. On the morning of July 19th, they fired the engine again and slipped into lunar orbit. 21 hours later, Armstrong and Aldrin crawled into the lunar module, call sign Eagle, and undocked from Columbia. Collins watched them drift away, then turned his craft so he could see the engine plume when they fired to descend. He would orbit alone for nearly a day, his world reduced to gauges, checklists, and the curve of the moon. As Eagle began its powered descent on July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin peered through small triangular windows at a landscape unlike any they had ever seen. Craters slid beneath them in a slow scroll, their rims casting sharp shadows. The guidance computer flashed 1202 and 1201 alarms. In Houston, controllers recognized them as harmless overflows and told the crew to continue. At 500 feet, Armstrong saw that the autopilot was steering them toward a field of boulders. He took manual control, pitched forward, and hovered, using bursts of the descent engine to steer toward a smoother patch. Aldrin read out fuel and altitude, 160 feet, velocity down to 90 seconds. With seconds of fuel remaining, the contact light illuminated. "Houston, Tranquility Base here," Armstrong radioed. "The Eagle has landed." Mission control erupted in cheers and sighs. Armstrong and Aldrin shut down the engine, donned their suits, and depressurized the cabin. When Armstrong swung open the hatch and climbed down the ladder, hundreds of millions watched via a ghostly black and white broadcast. He stepped onto the powdery surface and said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." A few minutes later, Aldrin joined him, describing the view as magnificent desolation. They moved with a curious loping gait, planted a flag that seemed to ripple in a vacuum, and conducted experiments, a seismometer to listen for moonquakes and a retroreflector to bounce lasers back to Earth. They collected 21 kilograms of rocks and soil. Their visit lasted just over 2 hours, but its impact was immeasurable. Inside Eagle, a plaque attached to one of its legs read, "We came in peace for all mankind." Around the world, people repeated that phrase, feeling for a moment that national rivalries had been set aside. After a short rest on the moon's surface, Armstrong and Aldrin lifted off in the ascent stage and rendezvoused with Collins in lunar orbit. The engine of their little craft worked perfectly, rising in a stream of flame and leaving behind the descent stage and their footprints. The docking with the command module was precise. The two travelers floated through the hatch, and the lunar module was jettisoned to crash into the moon. 3 days later, on July 24th, the command module Columbia plunged into Earth's atmosphere and splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The astronauts emerged from their capsule into the glare of television lights, wearing biological isolation garments. They waved and were whisked to a quarantine facility. Horns honked, church bells rang, and children looked up at the moon with new intimacy. The journey, though measured in days, transformed millennia of human imagination into fact. The names Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins became part of our shared story, not because they claimed a territory, but because they embodied a willingness to step into the unknown with humility and care. The first human footsteps on the moon were followed not by complacency, but by refinement. 4 months after Apollo 11, a smaller crowd gathered for Apollo 12, commanded by Pete Conrad with crewmates Alan Bean and Dick Gordon. Rain and lightning crackled at launch, briefly knocking out telemetry, but the Saturn V shrugged it off and rose into the storm. Their mission tested precision. They landed within walking distance of the unmanned Surveyor 3 probe on the smooth plain of Oceanus Procellarum. Conrad bounded down the ladder with a broad grin and quipped, "That may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me." Bean collected pieces of Surveyor to bring home, while Gordon piloted the command module Yankee Clipper. Apollo 12 showed that the first landing was not luck. Humans could return to the moon and land where they intended. The next planned mission, Apollo 13, lifted off in April 1970 with Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. 2 days out, a cry of, "Houston, we've had a problem," crackled across the void. An oxygen tank had exploded, crippling the command module. Water supplies dwindled. Lovell and his crew powered down the command module and retreated into the lunar module Aquarius, using it as a lifeboat. Engineers on the ground improvised new procedures. They built a carbon dioxide scrubber from plastic bags and duct tape, calculated burn times on slide rules, and devised a trajectory that would loop the spacecraft around the moon and back. As Aquarius passed over the lunar far side, the astronauts looked down at the craters they would not visit. Their focus remained on survival. 4 days later, after fighting freezing temperatures and exhaustion, they re-entered the command module, jettisoned the lunar module, and splashed down safely in the Pacific. The world exhaled. Apollo 13 became a story of failure turned to triumph. Not a landing, but a rescue achieved through ingenuity and calm. The program resumed with Apollo 14 in February 1971. Alan Shepard, the first American in space, returned to command with Edgar Mitchell and Stuart Roosa. Shepard and Mitchell landed at Fra Mauro, the site intended for Apollo 13, lugging a two-wheeled cart filled with tools and samples. They hiked up the edge of Cone Crater, took core samples, and as their EVA ended, Shepard pulled out a makeshift 6-iron and hit a golf ball into the lunar distance. The mission demonstrated the crew's resilience and the flexibility of the hardware. Each of these flights carried a different flavor: joy, crisis, redemption, but all contributed to the evolving understanding of lunar geology and human capability. As the third and final landing missions approached, NASA considered how to carry more gear and travel farther. The next act would involve wheels rolling on lunar dust and astronauts driving across crater rims. With the later Apollo missions, exploration became more ambitious. NASA added a folding electric car called the Lunar Roving Vehicle, enabling astronauts to travel kilometers away from their landers and gather more diverse samples. In July 1971, Apollo 15 carried David Scott, Jim Irwin, and Al Worden. Scott and Irwin landed near Hadley Rill, a sinuous gorge carved by ancient lava flows. They drove across the highlands, climbed the base of Mount Hadley, and hammered a core tube 8 feet into the regolith. Scott performed a famous demonstration of Galileo's theory by dropping a feather and a hammer at the same time, watching them hit the ground together in the moon's airless environment. Worden, orbiting above, photographed the lunar surface with a mapping camera and later conducted the first deep space EVA on the return trip to retrieve film. Next came Apollo 16 in April 1972 with John Young, Charlie Duke, and Ken Mattingly. Young and Duke landed in the Descartes Highlands, a rugged region once thought volcanic. They drove their rover across rough terrain, collected rocks shot through with crystalline structures, and discovered that the highlands were formed not by volcanism, but by ancient impacts. Mattingly, meanwhile, orbited in the command module and conducted astronomical observations. The final lunar voyage, Apollo 17, lifted off at night in December 1972. Its orange flame lit the Florida coast like a second dawn. Commander Eugene Cernan, command module pilot Ron Evans, and geologist Harrison Schmitt made up the crew. Schmitt, the first scientist astronaut to walk on the moon, brought a geologist's eye to the mission. With Cernan, he explored the Taurus-Littrow Valley, driving the rover farther than any prior crew, discovering bright orange soil that turned out to be volcanic glass, and collecting rocks revealing the moon's violent past. During their last EVA, Cernan paused before climbing the ladder and spoke to those watching. "We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind." On December 14th, he became the last human to stand on the moon, his footprints joined by Schmidt's in the dust around the Challenger lander. After Apollo 17 returned, budget cuts and shifting priorities ended the program. The final 3 planned missions were canceled. The hardware built for them would be used for Skylab and other projects. Within 3 years, the launch pads that had thundered with Saturn V roars fell quiet. Yet the legacy of the late Apollo missions endured. The rovers allowed for deeper field work. The samples provided evidence of volcanic eruptions billions of years ago, and the human stories of perseverance and curiosity inspired students to become scientists. Even as the boots were dusted off and stored in museums, the images of astronauts driving across an alien landscape remained, hinting at the adventures that future generations might renew. When the Apollo program ended, the dream of spaceflight did not end. It changed its rhythm. The United States turned a spare Saturn V into Skylab, an orbital workshop launched in 1973. 3 crews lived aboard for weeks and months, conducting solar observations, studying the effects of weightlessness on bone and muscle, and photographing Earth in unprecedented detail. Skylab taught astronauts how to fix equipment on the fly, as when they unfurled a jammed solar panel and installed a sunshade to cool the station. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, continued building its Salyut space stations, refining the art of long-duration flight and docking. In July 1975, the Cold War's fierce competition softened into a handshake when an Apollo spacecraft docked with a Soviet Soyuz. The commanders, Tom Stafford and Alexei Leonov, gripped hands and exchanged toasts while cameras rolled. Televisions on both sides of the Iron Curtain showed smiles instead of stern speeches. It was a symbolic end to the space race and the start of cooperation. The next great leap in U.S. spaceflight came with the Space Shuttle. Columbia lifted off in 1981 on a pillar of reusable rockets and a winged orbiter. For 3 decades, the shuttle fleet launched satellites, carried scientific laboratories, and deployed and repaired the Hubble Space Telescope. It also ferried astronauts of many nations and professions, opening space to teachers and physicians. Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour became household names. But the shuttle era was marked by tragedy. In 1986, Challenger broke apart shortly after launch. In 2003, Columbia disintegrated during re-entry. Each disaster led to mourning, investigations, and redesigns. Even so, the shuttle laid the foundation for the International Space Station. Beginning in 1998, modules built by the United States, Russia, Europe, Japan, and Canada were assembled in orbit. The ISS became a continuous laboratory and a symbol of collaboration. Former adversaries shared meals and research, looked down at borders blurred by distance, and recorded daily life in zero gravity. By the early 2000s, permanent crews rotated every 6 months, performing experiments in biology, fluid physics, and astrophysics. Astronauts from Brazil, Malaysia, South Africa, and many other countries joined, turning the station into a global outpost. Space became less a battlefield and more a workspace, a place where nations could work side by side. The arc of human spaceflight had bent from rivalry toward partnership, and while budgets fluctuated and public interest waxed and waned, the presence of humans beyond Earth had become an enduring element of our species' story. The question was no longer whether we could reach orbit, but where we would go next, and with whom. Beyond the orbiting laboratories, robotic explorers continued to stretch the imagination. While humans focused on building space stations, uncrewed probes ventured to the outer planets and beyond. The Voyager spacecraft, launched in 1977, used a rare planetary alignment to visit Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. They sent back images of swirling storms, icy rings, and blue methane clouds. In 1990, Voyager 1 turned its camera toward home at Carl Sagan's request and captured the pale blue dot, Earth appearing as a tiny pixel in a beam of sunlight. The photograph echoed the Earthrise image, reminding us that even from billions of miles away, our world is fragile. During the same decades, Mars became a proving ground for endurance. Viking landers in 1976 sniffed the thin atmosphere and took panoramic photographs. In 1997, the Pathfinder mission dropped the Sojourner rover onto a rocky plain, watching it explore like a robotic pet. Spirit and Opportunity followed in 2004, twin rovers designed to last 90 days. They survived for years, trundling across sand dunes and crater rims and sending sunrise photos. Curiosity, arriving in 2012, drilled into rocks and found evidence of ancient lake beds. Later missions carried small helicopters that danced above the red soil, demonstrating flight in thin air. Each mission carried the hearts of the students and engineers who built them. Each squeak of a wheel or snap of a camera lens was the sound of human curiosity made metal. Closer to home, telescopes expanded our view. The Hubble Space Telescope, deployed by the shuttle in 1990 and repaired in orbit multiple times, revealed galaxies forming, nebulae glowing, and supernova exploding. Its images hung in classrooms and museums. In 2021, the James Webb Space Telescope, launched aboard an Ariane 5, unfurled its gold mirrors and stationed at a gravitational balance point. Its infrared eyes peered into the earliest epochs of the universe, showing stars and galaxies emerging from darkness. These glimpses across space and time broadened the stage upon which human stories played. Yet, even as our instruments improved, we were reminded that exploration carries risk. The loss of the shuttle Columbia in 2003, following the earlier tragedy of Challenger, underscored the need for humility and resilience. Mission control teams, who once celebrated landings, now read the names of fallen colleagues at memorials. Flags flew at half-staff, programs paused, but exploration continued, not out of recklessness, but out of a deep belief that knowledge and wonder outweigh fear. The decades between Apollo and Artemis were a tapestry of triumph and loss, of images that shrank our planet and expanded our hearts. They taught us that while human footprints were absent from other worlds, our robots could roam, our telescopes could see, and our imagination could stretch farther than ever before. As the 20th century ended and the 21st began, space no longer belonged to two superpowers alone. Europe developed its own launch vehicles, culminating in the Ariane 5 and Vega rockets that carried satellites, telescopes, and cargo to orbit. The European Space Agency partnered on missions such as Rosetta, which rendezvoused with a comet and sent a small lander, Philae, bouncing across its surface. Japan's H-to-IA rockets lofted probes to the moon and asteroids. China, after decades of methodical development, launched its first astronaut, Yang Liwei, in 2003, aboard Shenzhou 5. He orbited the Earth for 21 hours, becoming the third nation to achieve human spaceflight. In the years that followed, China built and occupied a series of Tiangong experimental modules, performed spacewalks, landed rovers on the far side of the Moon and Mars, and began assembling a modular space station. India sent its Mars orbiter mission, Mangalyaan, to the Red Planet in 2013 on a budget smaller than many Hollywood films, and later placed the Chandrayaan landers near the lunar South Pole. Countries like Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and South Korea also launched probes, demonstrating that curiosity is universal. At the same time, a new type of player emerged: private companies. In the early 2000s, entrepreneurs began to treat spaceflight as both exploration and enterprise. SpaceX, founded by Elon Musk, focused on reducing launch costs through reusability. Its Falcon 9 rockets landed upright on barges and concrete pads, their engines throttling like balletic dancers. Blue Origin tested vertical takeoff and landing with New Shepard. Virgin Galactic experimented with suborbital spaceplanes. These efforts were more than stunts. They represented a shift in how humans might access the sky. Governments began to purchase cargo and crew services from companies, transforming NASA from operator to customer. In 2012 and 2015, SpaceX's Dragon capsules delivered cargo to the ISS and then later astronauts. The retirement of the shuttle fleet in 2011 made these partnerships essential. International cooperation extended beyond hardware. In 2020, the United States and several other nations signed the Artemis Accords, outlining principles for responsible exploration and resource use on the Moon and beyond. China and Russia proposed their own International Lunar Research Station. The idea of a single space race gave way to overlapping circles of cooperation and competition. More voices entered the conversation, from scientists in Lagos to entrepreneurs in Bangalore. In classrooms across continents, children followed launches in multiple languages, built model rockets, and imagined themselves floating in stations yet to be launched. The narrative of space, once narrow and nationalistic, had broadened to include a tapestry of cultures and motivations, all looking up at the same moonlit sky and seeing a future there. By the middle of the 2020s, talk of lunar footprints returned. NASA's Artemis 3 mission in 2022 sent an uncrewed Orion capsule around the Moon and back, proving that the new space launch system and capsule could endure deep space flight. The mission flew farther from Earth than any crew-rated spacecraft in history, and views of the Moon from high above its surface showed a world both familiar and newly distant. The successful splashdown rekindled public fascination and set the stage for crewed missions. The next flight, Artemis Ascent, is planned as a crucial dress rehearsal. Over roughly 10 days, 4 astronauts will test hardware, software, communications, and human health systems while looping around the Moon on a free return path. The crew, a commander, a pilot, and 2 mission specialists, represents a new era, the first woman and the first person of color to travel beyond low Earth orbit and the first international partner to do so as part of this program. Their trajectory will carry them farther from home than any humans in more than half a century, offering long, silent views of the lunar far side and the thin glow of Earth in the distance. In mission control, the rhythm will feel both new and remembered. Consoles glow, loops open, call signs roll across the room. Checklists refine the choreography learned in Apollo and adapted through shuttle and station years. Even the cautions are familiar. Engineers have updated re-entry plans after lessons from the uncrewed test, adjusting the capsule's skip to a refined, lofted profile so that heat and loads remain within design margins. The goal is simple and demanding: to put the spacecraft through its paces and bring the crew home with data that turns confidence into certainty. Outside the glass, the world listens. Children track the countdown on classroom screens and tape paper moons to windows. Families recall grainy broadcasts of earlier eras, but the story now carries different faces and accents, a broader circle of dreamers. The spacecraft's cameras will show the moon slipping past, and the Earth hanging small and blue, and people will pause in kitchens and on trains to watch those images drift across their phones. The quiet beauty of the view will need no explanation. Artemis II will not land. Its purpose is to prove the path and prepare the hands that will. After the crew returns, the program turns toward the surface, assembling landers, tailoring suits, rehearsing the descent. Commercial partners refine vehicles that can touch down and rise again. International partners ready instruments that can sample ice and dust in polar shadows. Plans flex with schedules, budgets, and weather, but the arc is steady. The idea is not to repeat Apollo, but to build upon it, to learn how to stay. For those who look up at night, the moon remains the same lantern it has always been, silver on water and rooftops. Yet something in its light feels closer. The roll to the pad, the tower of white, the soft count of voices, all of it says that the long pause is ending. Soon a crew will ride a column of fire, glide over the Terminator into lunar night, and watch Earth rise with eyes that grew up never having seen it live. They will bring home new stories of weightlessness and silence, and those stories will settle beside the old ones, another layer of memory in the long human dream of touching the quiet moon. While new rockets rise from Florida and Texas, another light climbs from across the world. China's space ambitions have unfolded quietly but steadily, each mission building upon the last with measured precision. In the vast Gobi Desert, launch towers stand like mirages of steel, and the countdown echoes in Mandarin beneath an endless sky. A column of flame lifts another crew toward Tiangong, the heavenly palace, a name that feels less poetic than it once did, for the station now orbits permanently, circling the planet every 90 minutes. Inside its narrow corridors, astronauts float through soft blue light. They grow plants in sealed chambers, test new life support systems, and watch thunderstorms bloom across the Pacific. Their voices, calm and deliberate, drift down to Earth through a lattice of satellites. The station passes over deserts, then jungles, then sleeping cities. 16 sunrises and sunsets sweep by each day. For those who gaze upward at twilight, it appears as a slow-moving star, a quiet sign of how far a dream can travel when tended with patience. Beyond Tiangong, China prepares for the next horizon, a pair of robotic landers designed to build the first elements of a lunar base near the moon's southern pole. Solar arrays will unfold like petals. Small habitats will follow. The plan is not of conquest, but of endurance, a methodical return to a place that humanity has touched only briefly. Other nations watch with a mixture of admiration and urgency. Once again, the moon gathers us not as rivals, but as participants in a larger human pattern, a pattern of reaching, learning, and looking back. Around the globe, a new generation watches these launches on small screens. Children trace the path of rockets across digital maps. Teachers pause lessons so their classes can witness history. They hear that humans will soon walk on lunar soil again, not as Americans or Chinese alone, but as representatives of everyone who has ever looked up at night. In living rooms and open fields, people lift their eyes to the same pale disk and imagine what comes next. Perhaps it will be Artemis crews landing near frozen craters, or private explorers testing engines that burn clean hydrogen. Perhaps it will be rovers from different continents meeting beneath the same low sun. However it unfolds, the story is no longer about a single flag or voice. It is a mosaic of languages, technologies, and dreams, all bound by gravity and light. The moon has become a mirror again, reflecting not who wins, but who continues to wonder. And when we look up tonight, the same stillness remains. The silver surface catches the glow of cities and the flicker of distant storms. Above it, stations and satellites trace faint threads of motion, weaving a silent connection between all who look skyward. The age of exploration has not ended. It has only softened into collaboration, a long breath shared among nations. The moon waits in its eternal calm, and humanity, older now and perhaps a little wiser, turns toward it once more, not to conquer, but to understand. Good night.